Critical race theory. It's a theory because it's an attempt to explain and understand a wide body of facts, specifically facts relating to racism in the United States. Hence the race part there in the middle. And critical race theory is critical because it focuses on the hidden or fundamental conditions that give rise to racism, with the intent of changing them. In its origin, CRT is a way of understanding the persistence of racial inequality in America despite improvements in legal equality. CRT assumes that these inequalities are the result of racism because no race group is naturally predisposed towards these negative outcomes. And here, racism is not just something that your embarrassing uncle does at a family gathering after a few beers. CRT understands racism differently, as something both pervasive and persistent, existing as a set of background conditions in things like access to healthcare, quality of education, housing, employment, and treatment by law enforcement. Furthermore, this kind of racism persists even when the internal operations of these institutions are perfectly fair and colorblind. How is this possible? Well, think about some sport where the rules of the game and the umpire's decisions are all completely on the level. Is this sport necessarily fair? Maybe not. We recognize that not everyone enters the circle of play on an equal footing. And even if they did, teams that win can leverage their winning status to create even more advantages for themselves. Again, remember, the rules internal to this sport and their adjudication are perfectly fair, and yet the outcomes are not. This is why CRT often questions the assumption and effectiveness of liberal values like equality and fairness. Next, because the background conditions that CRT describes are often non-obvious or even hidden, especially from those who don't feel their effects, finding and combating them requires paying attention to the experiences of the people who do experience them. This particular point comes from what is called standpoint epistemology. Now, there are other concepts associated with CRT as well, like interest convergence, intersectionality, and the social construction of race, which I won't cover, partly because their relation to CRT is a bit contested. Some of those who criticize CRT think that these concepts are dangerous and being smuggled into society via fashionable educational programs, government initiatives, and corporate sensitivity trainings, while supporters see them as less threatening, necessary, or just limited to academic CRT, which is separate from popular anti-racism efforts. Personally, I think that the concerns about CRT just mentioned are definitely overblown, and it's clear that many are just using the term cynically as a kind of political branding or scare word to gain cheap electoral or culture war victories, or to infringe on free expression and academic freedom. On the other hand, liberal defenders are sometimes guilty of smoothing over CRT's radical edges in an effort to make it more acceptable to sympathetic audiences, a kind of conceptual shell game that allows them to ignore both the drawbacks of CRT itself as well as the actual issues that CRT critics are clumsily trying to highlight. There are also critics who argue that CRT is itself overly cynical, leading it towards lazy, knee-jerk interpretations of complex issues, and even fostering outright paranoia and conspiracy theory type thinking. In practical terms, the argument is that the cynicism is actually counterproductive, and the ultimate aims of CRT might be better served by a more idealistic outlook. What do you think? Is CRT continuous with the unpopular, popular anti-racism efforts? Is it really the philosophical underpinning of these practices, as critics claim? And if it is, does this warrant an outright rejection of CRT? Or is there a way to separate what is good about it from what isn't? Is there a better way of translating the insights of academic CRT into corporate, government, or educational settings? Obviously, there's a lot more to say on this topic, but I hope that this primer was at least a little bit useful. My recommendation is that if CRT should come up in a discussion that you're having, and if that discussion is not explicitly about the definition of CRT, try to avoid the term and focus on the concrete issues instead. Check out the description for some links to articles that I found useful and interesting on this subject, and as usual, thanks for listening.
When they speak against us, we're going to speak things of love toward them. We're not going to let their hatred turn us around, but we're going to love them on every side.